Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Southern Plains Climate Science webinar series. I am your host and the coordinator of this series, Cody Nguyen, and I work with the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. The Southern Plains Climate Science webinar series is a platform that we use to highlight our center's funded projects, which can span across the multi-eco regions that make up our center's region, which is Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana. Joining me today is my colleague, Marina Tomer, previously known as Marina Kakuza, and she is our research coordinator, and she will be leading the Q&A session after today's presentation. Now, I am happy to introduce our guest presenter, Dr. Camille Stagg. She is a research ecologist at the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center. And her research focuses on how global stressors affect ecosystem functions, such as elevation change, carbon cycling, and resilience. Her goal is to understand how these processes respond to climate change stressors like sea level rising, elevated atmospheric CO2, and land use change, and then provide guidance to the management or restoration of these dynamic ecosystems. And today we have the pleasure to learn about her recently completed South Central CASC-funded project titled Understanding Impacts of Sea Level Rise and Land Management on Critical Marsh Habitat. Welcome, Dr. Camille Stagg.
Thank you so much, Cody, and thank you, Marina, for inviting me today. I am very excited to share with you guys the research that we have been conducting over the last 2 years. So as Cody mentioned, this work spanned 2020 to 2022. And so I'll be sharing some recently published papers, as well as some results that are still coming out in upcoming products. And then finally, at the end, I'll describe the next phase of our project, phase 2, which just recently started with the South Central CASC. And so the first phase of the study that I'll be primarily talking about today focused on quantifying the impacts of climate and land use change on coastal salt marshes in Louisiana, with an emphasis on sea level rise, hydrologic restoration, and carbon sequestration. And I would like to acknowledge all of the team members here. You can see it's a really long list, and I didn't do any of this work on my own. This was really a huge team effort, and it's been great working with all of these people. We had contributions from scientists and colleagues from across the USGS, as well as academia. So first, I'll just talk about wetlands. Why are coastal wetlands important? I know that I see a lot of you guys are from the area, so you probably are aware, but Louisiana coastal wetlands are very important to local and regional economies, as well as the ecology. They provide nursery habitats for fishery species and ecologically important species. Over 2/3 of the world's fisheries depend on coastal wetlands for at least a portion of their life cycle. And a large portion of the central flyway population uses Gulf Coast wetlands for either overwinter or migratory habitats. Wetlands provide storm protection and reduce the force of floodwaters, and they also improve water quality through nutrient retention and absorption of other constituents of concern. Another important ecosystem service provided by coastal wetlands is carbon sequestration, and it's been gaining a lot more interest in recent years. Carbon sequestration is a fundamental ecosystem service, and it provides 2 key benefits. First is coastal resilience, and secondly, climate mitigation. And these are synergistic, and they feed back on one another. Carbon sequestration in healthy coastal wetlands supports the accumulation of soil over time, which is sequestered in deep in soil layers below the wetland surface. And as soil carbon is accumulated and sequestered, It removes CO2 from the atmosphere, which effectively reduces greenhouse gas emissions and mitigates climate impact. And so then we get reductions in temperature, sea level rise, and that supports healthy coastal wetlands. And so to address the climate crisis, the key management need at both the national and local level is the development of climate mitigation strategies that take advantage of these ecosystems and synergistic processes. And because of their ability to trap large amounts of carbon in the soil, coastal wetlands are going to play a really important role in these mitigation strategies. So as I mentioned, this study was conducted in coastal Louisiana. Louisiana is rich in coastal wetlands and contains over 40% of the nation's coastal wetlands within its borders. But land loss is a really major problem here in this region where rates of relative sea level rise are very high. And so in this map by Cuviant et al. From 2017, we see that colors of red and blue represent land area that has been lost since 1932 and up to 2016. The rates of sea level rise in Louisiana, which I mentioned, are very high. This is in part due to high rates of land subsidence. So this results from compaction of Holocene sediments that have been deposited over thousands of years in the Mississippi River Deltaic Plain. Sea level rise can lead to wetland loss in multiple ways, but two main processes are erosion and slow subsidence or submergence. In this video here, we can see how wave action can break down the marsh soil platform. And this is commonly observed along the edge of wetland ecosystems. The other process, subsidence, which is slower and typically occurs in the interior of the marsh, we see increasing flooding, longer and deeper flooding that causes plant mortality and eventual conversion to open water. Changes in land use can also impact wetland health, both through direct and indirect pathways. This figure shows an example of direct effects where pipelines have been excavated. So this is the direct removal of wetland habitat. These land use changes can also indirectly affect wetland health through altering the hydrology of the ecosystem. And so all of these things, all of these drivers, they result in the altered hydrology. And this can disrupt critical processes of wetland elevation gain. And so in order for a wetland to keep pace with sea level rise, it must increase its elevation as water elevations increase. This happens through organic matter production and sediment deposition. However, alteration of the natural hydrology of Louisiana wetlands has restricted sediment deposition. And so wetlands are basically starved of this valuable resource, leading to subsidence and wetland loss. So one way to mitigate this land loss is through restoration of the hydrology. One way to do that is to divert water and sediments from the Mississippi River. This video shows the benefits of diverting river water that has high sediment loads. The sediments support land building and creation of wetlands. And this is a particular example of a sediment-focused diversion that's being planned for Mid-Barataria Basin in Louisiana. So our project is focusing on how these drivers of climate, so sea level rise, affect wetland ecosystems, and how restoration can potentially mitigate those effects. The first objective was to understand how sea level rise affects carbon sequestration. Specifically, how does the conversion of a vegetated marsh to open water affect soil carbon sequestration? Secondly, we wanted to know how restoration activities would affect carbon dynamics, and we were interested in these sediment diversions, as I showed in the previous slide. And so understanding the mechanism of wetland loss will allow us to identify which levers and switches are available to managers to reverse wetland loss. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is a schematic of some common terms used to define carbon sequestration. For this study, for the first objective, we will be talking about soil carbon sequestration. And carbon sequestration can be measured in a couple of different ways. We're measuring soil carbon storage and accumulation. And we are also measuring the sum of carbon entering and exiting the system. So the net flux of carbon in both the atmosphere, and this is called vertical flux, and in the aquatic pool, which is called lateral flux. And so with all of these data, we can calculate net ecosystem carbon balance, or how much carbon is being stored in the ecosystem versus how much is being lost from the ecosystem. Again, our first objective was to look at this conversion from vegetated marsh to open water. And so to do this, we established a chronosequence of wetland submergence spanning over 21 years. So we identified vegetated marshes and then interior ponds within a coastal Louisiana salt marsh that ranged in age from 0 to over 21 years. And we measured soil structure, soil carbon, microbial communities and functions within these vegetated and ponded ecosystems. Our first question was to understand what happens to soil structure following wetland submergence. And so we investigated the shear strength of salt marshes and unvegetated interior ponds using a geotechnical methodology called cone penetrometer testing. And so using this, this instrument, which is here in the bottom right-hand corner of this figure, we were able to measure how the conversion from vegetated marsh to open water affected soil strength. This figure shows soil shear strength with depth, and the depth is rectified to the North American vertical datum of 1988. And on the left is the vegetated marsh, and to the right are ponded sites with increasing age toward the right. And again, this is shear strength along the x-axis. And so on the far left, we can see that the shear strength in the vegetated marsh is much higher than the ponded sites. And following conversion from vegetated marsh to open water pond, the surface soils experienced a dramatic loss, not only in shear strength, but also in elevation. And this resulted from the loss of vegetation. So after vegetation mortality, the soils compacted and there was a loss of pore space. This loss of soil strength following the plant mortality is consistent with marsh collapse. And so for our subsequent modeling objectives that you'll see in just a moment, just keep in mind that we're working under this conclusion that these interior ponds were formed through subsidence following vegetation mortality, not erosion. And so these results highlight the important contribution of below ground biomass to marsh stability. And it shows that the loss of this vegetation is a critical driver of marsh collapse in these Louisiana salt marshes. Our next objective was to quantify what happens to the soil carbon stocks after marsh collapse or following this conversion from vegetated marsh to open water pond. And on the left panel is a set of hypotheses about how this transition could affect soil carbon over time. And with all of the scenarios, we see that there's ultimately a decrease in carbon, but the timing of the loss differs. And this timing can have important implications for management. And it really matters because it dictates how fast your mitigation or restoration should take place. So we measured the change in soil carbon by collecting soil cores across the same chronosequence study design that spanned the transition from the vegetated marsh to open water. We also wanted to know more specifically about the mechanisms or what processes control the change in carbon following marsh collapse. And so to do this, we built a simple dynamic model that predicts soil carbon change over time with the conversion from vegetated wetland to open water. And there are 3 pools of carbon and only 2 that we are modeling. The fast pool or the plant biomass residues. Secondly, the slow pool or what we're calling humified carbon. And so in this model, carbon is introduced through biomass production through the plants. This is the fast pool, and the labile portion of the carbon is mineralized. It can be emitted as greenhouse gas, and then it is also converted to a more stable carbon or the slow pool, which is the humified carbon. The soil carbon can be introduced through accretion as well, accretion of sediments into the marsh. And so finally, we have the carbon which can move down core over time as we have burial, because as I mentioned, wetland surfaces increase over time. The soils become buried deeper and deeper as their accretion occurs over time. And this deep buried pool makes up the passive pool, which we didn't model here. So these figures show the empirical data, or what we actually observed in those cores that we took along the corona sequence. And on the left is the vegetated marsh, and in the middle is the submerged or ponded wetlands. And so when we compare the observations from the soil cores, we saw that immediately following the conversion to open water, there wasn't a significant change in the total soil carbon. The figure on the right shows how the model predictions align with our observation. And so we did see a lot of variation with depth within each of the cores and within the sites, but there were similar patterns among the vegetated and ponded sites. And overall, we didn't see a major difference in the 1 meter carbon stocks 14 years following submergence. And to get into our model predictions a little bit more, these figures show the projections, which were broken down into 2 pools. As you might remember, we have the fast pool on the far left, and then the slower stable pool in the middle. And immediately following submergence, we see that the fast pool or the labile pool declines significantly. But in the middle, we see that in contrast, the slow pool declines very slowly. And this is in part due to the change in carbon input, so the loss of biomass, but it's also due to changes in mineralization rates with depth. And so overall, for total carbon stocks, we found that in a Louisiana coastal salt marsh where submergence is due to the slow sinking or subsidence of the marsh platform, the time scale of the impact is really long, about 200 years. And over the long term, we observe eventually about a 40% net decline in soil carbon. So much of the carbon under this scenario of a slow subsidence interior pond, much of the carbon is retained. Compared to current assumptions, for example, in IPCC guidelines, the assumption is that 100% of the carbon is emitted to the atmosphere, and which is a very conservative and potentially appropriate assumption. But this shows that we have a lot of room to improve those estimates for those inventories. And so the results of our model indicated that the important parameters that were controlling changes in the patterns of soil carbon are related to how humification and mineralization vary with depth. And so the exciting part of this model really is that we can use it as a set of testable hypotheses to better understand what mechanisms are controlling these changes. And so first we developed this model based on our understanding of the literature and our experience and empirical data. And now we're testing some of these assumptions with field data. We collected data to test assumptions about all of the parameters, including anaerobic respiration, dissolved gas exchange, and microbial function. And all of this will improve model calibration and, more importantly, our understanding of what mechanisms and processes control the change in carbon and as we transition from a vegetated wetland to open water. So our second overall objective was to look at the effect of land management on carbon sequestration. And as I mentioned, we were interested in the sediment diversion, and our site is located within the planned outfall of the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion. However, this hasn't come online yet. And so right now we have the opportunity to collect baseline data to characterize the conditions, and so that we can compare those conditions after the diversion comes online. So right now we're focusing on characterizing baseline conditions. And just as a reminder, to do this, we are measuring the vertical flux of carbon. So that's the net change in the greenhouse gases, and also the lateral flux, and that's the net exchange of carbon within the water column, so dissolved carbon components. This allows us, again, to estimate net ecosystem carbon balance. And I've mentioned this before, but a nice way to think about net ecosystem carbon balance is net import, net export. And it is a very good ecosystem indicator, an indicator of health. So net import represents a healthy ecosystem, whereas net export represents a degrading system. The picture on the left shows our hydrologic station, which is instrumented with equipment to measure the net exchange of dissolved carbon. And the picture on the right is an eddy covariance tower, which measures the net exchange of the greenhouse gases, or the vertical flux. And so this comprehensive approach to measuring carbon flux is cutting edge. There are only a handful of sites that are equipped to do this in the entire country. And right now, to our knowledge, this is the only site in Louisiana and coastal wetlands that can provide such a comprehensive assessment of carbon fluxes. And so these figures show our vertical flux estimates over the last year. And currently, we are also measuring vertical fluxes at a fresh marsh and comparing to our salt marsh sites as well. It will help us to understand how salinity can affect greenhouse gas emissions. These figures show the mean diurnal flux patterns of carbon dioxide exchange with the atmosphere. And so positive fluxes are emissions and negative fluxes are sequestration. The graph on the left is located in the Davis Pond outfall. So this is the fresh marsh, and the graph on the right is the salt marsh that we have been discussing today. And again, that is located in the planned outfall of the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion. And so the blue bands represent fluxes in winter, the red bands in the fall, and the green bands are from the summer. In general, we see net sequestration during the night, net emission during the day, and overall we see, I'm sorry, that's the opposite of that. And then overall, we see that the minimum and maximum fluxes are similar between fresh and salt marsh, but the seasonal transitions are slightly different. And so in general, the emissions are higher, and sequestration is also highest in the summer. Our early data analysis also show that we have greater methane fluxes from the fresh marsh, but that's not shown here. And we are excited to see how the Mid-Barataria diversion will impact these patterns. And since we do have hourly data, we will be able to tie any deviations from these baselines to the operation of the diversion. For the lateral fluxes, we have continuous surface water and discrete pore water measurements for over 1.5 years from the salt marsh site. And so for poor water fluxes, we've been able to identify seasonal patterns that are unique to this region. So here in the northern Gulf of Mexico, winter storm fronts are a major force of lateral flux, whereas in other regions like the southeastern US, Atlantic coast, tidal flooding is the primary driver of lateral flux. And so in winter months, coastal waters are very low overall. Frontal passages with north winds quickly drop water levels, and this is followed then by shifts to winds from the south with increases over time. With the low water levels, this is an example on the left, poor waters from the surrounding marshes drain into the creek. And so the visible cloudy water is an indicator of poor water drainage. In the spring, which is shown on the right, in summer and fall, water levels are higher and there's little time for drainage of marsh poor waters. So in general, we get high export of dissolved carbon in the winter and not as much in the summer. We also had the opportunity to learn a lot from the record-breaking hurricane season in 2020. We had 3 storms that passed directly over our stations. On the bottom panel, we have a figure for Cristobal on the left, Marco in the middle, and Zeta on the right. And these figures show turbidity levels in blue and water levels in red. And we found that tropical storms are a really important source of sediment to the marshes. And this can also mean that important input of carbon to the marshes as well. So during Hurricane Zeta on the right, we observed water levels that covered the platform in this picture. It was basically a wall of water. And you can see that the storms delivered 2 orders of magnitude more sediment to the marsh than other storms. And so this helps us to get more of a baseline characterization of how carbon moves in and out of these systems, which we can compare to future storm events and also conditions under future restoration. So for the next phase of our study, which I'll just briefly introduce, we started this year, and one of our focuses is to characterize post-diversion conditions. So we're waiting on the sediment diversion to open, but we continue to collect data to improve our baseline. For example, we need a lot of data of this high resolution data to really get a good characterization of baseline conditions in an area that's so dynamic. With all of the storms that pass through this area, it's really important to get as much data as possible. And so we're continuing to work on characterizing the net ecosystem carbon balance of this salt marsh. The second objective of our current phase 2 study is to develop a decision support tool that will inform climate action planning. We're using all of the field data that are presented today, as well as remotely sensed data to develop this tool that will be helpful for planners and managers. It'll provide historic and future projections of carbon sequestration under multiple scenarios of climate and land use change. So the modeling framework, which conceptual figure is shown here, it's called LUCAS. It's the Land Use Carbon Simulator. And it links a land cover change model and a carbon budget model to make future projections with uncertainty and with spatially explicit output. So we'll use all of that field data that you saw today to parameterize the carbon budget model, link that to land cover change models to get output projections of the carbon consequences of restoration and land use change. And so we're able to produce maps of future carbon sequestration rates given these different scenarios of land management and climate change. And these are going to be used to develop climate mitigation plans that focus on natural ecosystems. Currently, we're partnering with the state of Louisiana to develop relevant scenarios of land management for consideration in the state's climate action plan. In 2020, the governor of Louisiana set ambitious climate targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And to accomplish this, the state needs future projections of carbon sequestration from multiple policy portfolios. And so on the far right is an initial simulation in the current action plan, which did not have sufficient data to quantify the contributions of natural ecosystems to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so although it's definitely clear that carbon sequestration in natural lands is only a small part of the overall plan, natural climate solutions are really critical to achieving net zero emissions in Louisiana. And so for the policies that are related to coastal wetlands, our model projections will help to inform the outcome of specific land management policies on net greenhouse gas reductions. And that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Dr. Stagg, so much for your presentation. It was so informational. And thank you, Marina, for leading the Q&A. That was a wonderful presentation and questions involved. To close this out, I want to let you guys all know that we will have future webinars starting next year. We usually have 4 each year about any other activities that we have going on. Please follow that link and that will take you to our newsletter where you can sign up and follow all the great things that we're doing. And if you would like to know more about our funded projects and what we have funded in the past and what we are currently funding, please follow that link and you can read up on all of our projects. But again, thank you everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to you joining us in the future.